Warning, the following video contains material that may be disturbing to some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Breonna Taylor.
A woman was shot and killed in her apartment.
George Floyd died in police custody after an officer pressed his knee into Floyd's neck.
He said, "I can't breathe," eerily similar to what we heard in 2014 with Eric Garner.
Criminal investigation accused officers Kevin Piner and Brian Gilmore and Corporal Jesse Moore of violating standards of conduct and using inappropriate slurs, including the N-word.
In Louisiana, where a police officer who shared a racist image on social media has been promoted to chief.
Officer with the California Highway Patrol beating a woman along the side of a freeway.
A witness shot this video when police arrived, showing an officer using what some say is excessive force on a teenage girl.
Hi.
Okay.
What's your license?
I don't have it on me.
You have any ID on you?
Why am I getting pulled over?
I'm at 600 West Indian School Road.
Why am I getting pulled over?
Is this your car?
No.
Bravo John Sam,
Why am I getting
5455. Do you have ID on you?
No. Why am I getting pulled over?
Put your hands behind your back.
Excuse me!
Put your hands behind your back!
No!
Put your hands behind your back! Stop! Stop!
Shocking new video showing the moment an Indianapolis police officer appears to kick a black man in the face while he's on the ground in handcuffs.
We're not going to do this, right?
The body.
And that should trouble all of us. This is not just a black issue. It's not just a Hispanic issue. This is an American issue.
As officers are revealed to have ties to extremist groups, these actions flow perpendicular and may undermine their oaths to protect, serve, and effectively engage with community members. The unfortunate reality also exists that some choose to become police officers to push the agendas of hate groups which propagate domestic terrorism. The Peace Coalition exposes hate-based, bias-informed violence and discrimination affecting minority groups by law enforcement officials, as it is an example of domestic terrorism that is understated within the United States. The Peace Coalition, Policing Efforts and Community Engagement Coalition, exists to increase social awareness of domestic terrorism, racial hatred, bias, cultural illiteracy, and targeted violence incidents originating on U.S. soil affecting minority groups of color and other marginalized groups. Through its National Campaign for Peace, Public Safety, and Community Wellness, the Peace Coalition bridges communication gaps created by cultural illiteracy among divided or estranged groups of people and facilitates and encourages cross-cultural discourse on a range of nuanced topics by means of diverse community building interventions. Through its Common Ground board game, the Peace Coalition podcast, and other integrated social and traditional media tactics, the Peace Coalition elevates far-reaching collective values of social connectedness, personal and public safety, and civic responsibility for all.
Our target audiences break down into three key groups: law enforcement practitioners, victims of police brutality, and the Howard University student body. While our key audiences share geographic similarities, their psychographics and demographics, along with a myriad of other factors, play an integral role in their perception of and experiences with one another. Commonly, each group shares the mutual concern of public safety and stability, which is where the Peace Coalition steps in.
Preliminary research has supported the reality that white supremacist extremism is present within law enforcement in the U.S. The following research found is evidence that violence within law enforcement is a pressing matter and blatant example of domestic terrorism in this country. According to the Anti-Defamation League, there have been a total of 76 instances which a member of law enforcement was identified as a member of or showed support for a dangerous extremist group. According to an article in the Washington Post, Black men are 2.5 times more likely to be shot and killed by police than white men. The members of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology found that police officers were more likely to mistake an object for a weapon when interacting with an African American versus a white individual. The Peace Coalition has found throughout this research that racial bias is one of the leading factors that explains the disproportionate rate between killings of Black men and white men by law enforcement, thus creating an immediate need for solution and conversation around this issue.
One of our key tactics was the Peace Coalition podcast. Our podcast was created with the intention to highlight the factors that contribute to the radicalist and extremist mistreatment of minority individuals conducted by law enforcement, such as unconscious bias, discrimination, and white supremacist groups' infiltration into law enforcement. Our goal was to conduct controversial but healthy conversations to explore the roots of these problems. We invited thought leaders in these previously mentioned subject areas to be guests on the podcast in hopes that we can not only educate listeners, but better understand what is already being done to combat extremism within law enforcement. Our first guest speaker was Howard University psychology professor, Dr. Jamie Barden. Dr. Barden has written numerous peer-reviewed articles on implicit bias and its impact on our everyday actions. More importantly, we discuss strategies on how people can actively target the prejudice within themselves and condition their brains into a new style of thinking, and how police officers could incorporate these concepts into their training. Our second guest speaker was Mr. Marvin Heyman, Chief of Staff for the Metropolitan Police Department of DC. In this interview, we discuss ways that the Metropolitan Police Department is trying to combat the negative reputation of police officers. We discuss their training tactics and how they determine if someone is a good fit for the culture that they are trying to cultivate at MPD.
Collectively, we understood the need for products, initiatives, and tools that open up the floor for complex conversations around racial, implicit, or hate-based bias. As a response, we introduced a conversation-based board game called Common Ground, which performs as an educational and preventative measure to combat targeted violence and domestic terrorism within law enforcement due to association with extremist groups. Through active dialogue among selected participants, Common Ground may mitigate susceptibility to recruitment for extremist groups and expand awareness on experiences and perspectives unique to marginalized groups of people, furthering our efforts towards collective values of peace, community togetherness, and competency for future recruits.
The Peace Coalition cultivates key messages and social awareness of domestic terrorism, racial hatred, and bias through multiple digital platforms. We have created social media content and graphics for our Instagram account in order to engage with our targeted audience while spreading awareness to the realities of targeted violence with law enforcement against minority communities. We received the most engagement on social graphics containing statistics. Our organization uses Spotify as a platform to host the Peace Coalition podcast, which serves as a tool to increase awareness of implicit bias, its motivations, and how community members can actively work to target their own ideas that stem from prejudiced thought. Through the use of a news release, infographics, postcards, and posters, we shared our campaign's message and key messages effectively throughout the campaign.
As a team, we wanted to ensure our design and layout aligned with the rest of our campaign. The use of colors like red, black, and white offers a seamless display of content that appeases our audience visually and intellectually. Over the 1-month-long campaign, we acquired nearly 50% of our anticipated follower count, with an average engagement rate of 3.1%. This impact is reflected in our data for our most viewed reel at 3K and showed sustenance throughout several social posts. While we did not exceed our intended goals in the social space, our metrics reveal an inclination towards concise and informative content by our target audiences, helping us shift our focus throughout the campaign's duration. With a larger team and additional time, we believe our numbers and impact can soar across multiple social platforms, creating more opportunities for partnerships and sponsors.
Our cost-benefit analysis reflects the usage of our budget. About half our budget was used for materials for our community events, from our tabling events on campus to our Common Ground board game nights. The next highest section of our budget was board game production, along rewards and prizes for game participants, followed by travel budget expenses. The majority of our meetings were remote, but there were times that members of the Peace Coalition who resided too far away needed to be present to meet with the rest of the coalition, especially in regards to board game production. Lastly, we utilized the remaining budget for team paraphernalia to advertise the Peace Coalition and spark conversations on what we're all about.
We encountered 3 challenges during our project, but found a way to overcome each one. The first challenge came from the pandemic. We had difficulty getting access to local schools due to COVID-19 and other scheduling conflicts. Middle schoolers were part of our target audience, and we wanted to instill bias training or a simple understanding with them as part of our community events. Since we could not meet with them, we pivoted our efforts towards Howard University students. Ultimately, we had to hold twice as many tabling events in order to make up for missing out on the middle school students. Our second challenge was there was a shift in our campus climate during our campaign. Students were protesting inhabitable housing conditions under the hashtag Blackburn Takeover. Students were sleeping in tents on our main campus in protest of mold and mushrooms growing in their dorm rooms. While the campus focused on those issues, it presented us with an opportunity to take over social media. We began increasing our social media presence and heavily finding new guest speakers for our podcast to make sure our target audience still heard our message, because our main audience was glued to each platform to keep up with the protests. Our final challenge was a lighter one. It was balancing our senior capstone project with the Invent to Prevent project. It was difficult to meet deadlines between Invent and our capstone because we had entirely different expectations and guidelines for both projects. However, it became a blessing in disguise because we were lucky enough to repurpose some of our class projects for our Invent project, as our peers were our target audience.
In continuance of the work we began for the Peace Coalition, we would expand to collaborate with other universities for focus group participants to play common ground, furthering our opportunities for primary research and results. This will require additional resources and support in order that we maximize our impact across target audiences. In addition to partnering with MPD on community building efforts and initiatives, the Peace Coalition plans to further our Take the Pledge initiative. We envision similar interventionist programs can be implemented within law enforcement institutions nationally in alignment with our annual campaign for peace, public safety, and community togetherness. The Peace Coalition also endeavors to secure 25 community partnerships from local and national organizations, create a website for increased digital engagement, and launch FAIR, Finding Accountability and Inner Resilience Youth Resilience Program, designed to elevate moral resilience, bias awareness, and social connectedness through an anti-bullying and bias assembly, interactive classroom activities, and coloring book.